Hello everyone. How often when talking about cars do you hear the phrase "in the real world"? Usually when somebody's talking about some new great supercar, there'll always be that one person who pipes up and says, yeah, well, that's all well and good having 750 horsepower, but in the real world, my Golf's just as quick. Well, I've come to the real world, to this very busy and possibly familiar main road, to answer a slightly more pressing and very real world question. That is to say, how does this Audi RS3, a range-topping, fire-breathing, 5-cylinder, 400 horsepower hyperhatch, compare to its slightly more ordinary and conventional, yet much more affordable, smaller brother? You see, this is a real-world test. Hot hatch versus hyper hatch. Used versus new. And if you're an Audiophile, this, yes, is a pre-facelift car. This is a facelift car. There is, of course, a very large price differential between the two. There is also a large spec differential between the two. However, the question for today is, in the real world, do you notice a difference? And if you're one of those people that lusts after one of these, will you be just as happy with one of these? Before we go out, let's take a little look at what makes these cars different.
Cosmetically, you'd need to be an Audi fan to notice the difference. The facelifted RS3 has a sharper, more chiselled look accentuated by the aluminium styling pack on this particular car. Both feature interiors dominated by black leather, but the RS3 does have a slightly more high-end feel and has patches of Alcantara in it. The steering wheel design of the newer car is also different. The major difference between the two, of course, is under the bonnet. The S3 in this regard is quite close to its VAG stablemate, the Golf R, with a 4-cylinder engine producing around 300 horsepower in stock trim, driving all four wheels via a Haldex-based all-wheel drive system. These are remarkably durable engines, and with just a simple map you can see major and reliable increases in power. The RS3 though scores a major victory here by having a 5-cylinder engine, and recently revised it's now significantly lighter and more powerful than it was before, and this RS is some 33% punchier than the Golf with a headline figure of 400 horsepower.
We're now going to take the S3 out and set a baseline for our expectations. Now, the first thing that I should mention may sound insignificant, but it could be very important, and that's that the clutch pedal feel is nice, easy, and reasonably light. And that's very important because if you want an RS3, you don't have a choice of gearbox. You will have the 7-speed S-tronic double clutch unit, whether you like it or not. In the S3, you have a choice. The same S-tronic setup, or the very nice, very pleasant to use 6-speed manual. Now, if you're a fan of modding, I'm led to believe that the S-tronic box, which of course is a very close relation to Volkswagen's DSG unit, can take an awful lot more abuse than the manual will. However, as a driving tool, the manual is certainly very pleasant. It's very easy to use. The throw is nice and short. It's very direct, and it definitely adds an extra dimension to the sporty driving experience. Both of these are, let's face it, aimed at the driver that wants a practical but still sporting car. One thing which is very different, and actually took me a lot longer to notice than it really should have done, is the fact that this first generation car is a 3-door. Now, I had to double check this, but it seems that the 3-door has now disappeared from the entire A3 lineup. If you want a hatchback, it's going to be a 5-door. Now, I know plenty of people who sit on both sides of the fence as to which they prefer. Myself, I think if you're going to get a hatchback, a 5-door is probably a better idea. It is a better looking car, this early car. The 3 doors usually are. But I would say that the transition from 3 to 5 with the A3, and the S3 and the RS3 has probably been more successful than most other cars that I've seen, to the extent that it actually took me some time to notice it. Otherwise, initial impressions are of considerably more similarities than differences. Generally speaking, facelifts with some manufacturers can be quite comprehensive in the looks department alone, if not the mechanical. However, if you were to get me in this and then in the RS3, it might be reasonable to assume that the differences are simply because one is the RS and not because there's actually quite a bit of time difference between the two. Now, this car has about 46,000 miles on it, and it's worn those extremely well. None of the leather seems to have visibly marked or faded in any way. It still feels soft and supple. The steering wheel appears to have been hardly used, and this is, all told, a very pleasant place to be. One difference between the two cars that I can definitely feel is that I feel like I'm sat much higher in this car than I am in the RS. Now, from the driver's viewpoint, the main difference between these two is that this has a very traditional setup of 2 analog dials with a central digital display, and the RS3 has Audi's new virtual cockpit. Now, this car, of course, is missing a cylinder and about 500cc. This unit is a very, very well-known engine, and it appears in just about everything. It feels very strong. This is the kind of road that a hot hatchback lives for, and I must say that thus far the S3 is actually impressing me quite a bit. I'd say, if anything, bearing in mind that I've until now only had about 24 hours to get acclimatized to the RS, that this has a heavier steering feel, which I prefer, and possibly a little bit more feel through the corners. Now, historically, I'm really not much of a VAG person. It's been for a few different reasons, but it's never been for a particular dislike of the brand, simply that there were always other cars that I preferred. However, having spent recently a little bit more time in a number of Audis in particular, there are a few things that they do which I really like. Audi seem to get their steering wheels just right. For me, seats and steering wheels are criminally underrated. They are your 2 points of contact with the car. If they're not up to scratch, well, you're just not going to have a very good time. Now, this wheel is not the same as the one in the RS, although it does look superficially similar. It is flat-bottomed, as is the trend, and it is nice and thin. There is very little padding in it, which to me is very important. You could say that's reminiscent of real old school cars where they have wooden steering wheels. But to me, it's more important because it means what information is being fed through the electric steering system is going to be passed onto the driver without any sort of unnecessary insulation. Really, if one was looking to choose between this and a Golf, for example, I would probably say that you should go for the brand which appeals to you the most. Go for the car which is styled the way that you prefer it and just looks better to you, and so on. The reality is that the performance difference is basically negligible. The bigger differences are in the way that the car looks, both outside and in. I'm probably a fan of the exterior of the Golf, but the interior of this. One nice thing with this engine, unlike many other turbocharged units that I've driven, is that it really likes to rev all the way out. the way this thing devours a back road is quite sublime. Now, many people associate Audis with understeer, but on a day like today, even on these all-season tyres, I'm not really getting any. I'm quite impressed. Other differences between this and the RS3, as small as they may seem, but they don't seem important to mention, include the fact that they've obviously replaced the display here. Still works the same way. I love the fact that you can make it disappear, but this is a little lower resolution, not really an issue. The interface generally isn't quite as slick and modern feeling, but also this car has an efficiency setting. So you can choose from efficient, comfort, dynamic, individual or auto. Individual only gives you, in this car, 3 different parameters to configure. In the RS3, you get quite a few more. Let's talk about engine sound, shall we? Yes, this car has what VW call a sound actor. It's a very clever little device, and I don't claim to understand fully quite how it works, but it essentially makes the noise inside somewhat more vocal than it naturally would be. It's a very trick little piece of technology. Although I'm very much of the old school, I don't actually mind it. Yes, the volume might be artificial, but the actual noise itself is just an amplified version of what is actually generated by the engine. So it's not fake, it's not like it's playing an MP3, it's not like listening to an early Gran Turismo game in here, not at all. I would go so far as to say I really like the S3. Now, my pick of the bunch would probably be a saloon, and I do quite like the styling of the facelift. However, this car represents excellent value for money, especially when you compare it, albeit unfairly, with the new RS that I have for the week. How much is that price difference? Well, before we get onto that, let's hop into the RS and see how the performance differs. Now, even just a few feet off the line, I can tell you definitively that there are a few key differences between this and the S3. As suspected, in this car, I sit dramatically lower than I do in the S. I like that a lot. I've seen a few reviews where this double clutch box gets some stick for not being great around town, but in my brief time with the car so far, bearing in mind I've already covered about 300 miles, I really haven't had any issues with it in that regard. Like many gearboxes of this type, when you're not on it, it tries to do its best job to smooth out the shifts, and it doesn't respond brilliantly to use of the paddles. So when I'm driving around town, I just let it do its own thing, and then when I come across a more exciting and engaging road, I then switch it over into manual. And that really is, I think, how these things are intended to be driven. Yes, of course you could drive it through town in manual mode, but what's the point? On the whole, this does feel like a newer, slightly nicer car, and that, of course, is no surprise to anybody, because it is a newer, slightly nicer car. Some of my criticisms from the S3 apply here. Why are electric seats not standard on a £53,000 car? I appreciate that one could make an argument that they're lighter having manual seats, but the truth is that neither of these cars are particularly light. Both of them weigh somewhere between 15 and 1600 kilos, depending on spec and various different things. Now, one key piece of spec on this car that's going to make a real difference in terms of the driving experience is the optional wheels and tyres. Now, the regular setup on the S is 225 wide tyres all round on 18-inch rims. On this, the car sits on 19s, and this has by default 2 3.5s all round, but this car has the optional setup which features 2 5.5s at the front. Now, both cars use a version of Audi's trademark Quattro all-wheel drive system. I haven't been told definitively so, but I can imagine that they have been programmed differently. I understand that in this particular car, I can't say whether it's true for the S3, but in this it is true, the car can send up to 100% of its power to the rear. In truth though, this doesn't tend to feel like it ever does that. Its default mode is still very much front wheel driven. Now, these are the sorts of cars that are everyday usable, only cars for an awful lot of people, so economy is important. Official figures say that this car is about 6 mpg, that's UK, worse than the S3. So this does about 34 versus the S's 40. Now, the truth is that I've been enjoying this and driving it quite vigorously, so I obviously haven't been getting the ideal MPG figures from it. That being said, I certainly get somewhere in the 30s when I'm just driving normally and sensibly. And for a car with this kind of power output, I think that's pretty reasonable. It's very good, I think, of Audi that their quoted figures are actually very much real-world representative. 34 to the gallon might not sound great, but the truth of the matter is that I've driven cars with much smaller engines with a quarter of the power that this has, that have actually delivered real-world MPG only slightly better, so that should be taken into consideration. The S3 did not have any sort of adaptive or active suspension. This car does, so it gives me a few extra options when it comes to setting up your drive modes. Now, in addition to the engine, gearbox, steering and sound options that the S3 has, this car also has suspension control, it has Quattro and adaptive cruise control settings. Now, my personal preference is to have nearly all of those in dynamic, except the cruise control, which I leave into auto, and I usually set the suspension to comfort. This car rides a noticeable amount firmer than the S does, even in its comfort setting. Now that we're on slightly nicer, more fun roads, I'm going to turn into manual mode. Now, one thing this car has is a delicious soundtrack. Generally speaking, I wasn't fond of the sound that V10s make, and a 5-cylinder makes a very similar one. But actually, I'm growing to like it. I had, in truth, expected this car to be a lot louder. But like the S3, it's actually louder in here with the windows up than it is with the windows down, thanks to that sound generator that they use. Now, this car pulls hard. It is noticeably quicker than the S3. For me, one of the real gains of this engine isn't necessarily the higher headline figure, which by the way is about 90 horsepower up. This is a 400 horsepower hatchback. But the fact that this revs to 7,000, and that's not just the red line, the engine really wants to go all the way. Now, in the S3's favour, I would say that it is actually a slightly more enjoyable steer. I think when trying to counter criticisms that their cars understeer, Audi have obviously thrown everything they can at it. And I believe that those much larger, very sticky fronts, although incredibly effective, I haven't yet made this car understeer, have perhaps robbed it of a little bit of feel. Maybe there's a software tweak that can be done to improve this, because actually this car's steering is also a little lighter than the S's, and that doesn't make any sense at all, because with the slightly heavier car, and it's probably a little bit more front heavy as well, and those bigger boots at the front, this really should be the heavier car steering feel wise. And in terms of point to point speed, there's not a lot which is going to beat this. It's brutally fast. Let's come back to that phrase we started with, in the real world. In the real world, you would struggle to beat this. And the real world involves changing weather conditions. This week it has been sweltering. It's been absolutely obscene. I say this week, really, the last month in England has been biblically hot. But of course we do get winter, and as you'll probably remember if you've been watching my channel or that of other UK YouTubers for a while, we had a very long and a very harsh winter. And in those circumstances, having all-wheel drive of any variety is a great help. I had the Honda Civic Type R as a brief test car, and that was absolutely stunning when it was dry. But when it rained, the car really suffered. When one considers also that in the Porsche world, a Boxster S, which has a power output of 50 horsepower shy of this, starts at around the same price as this car comes on the road. I think this is actually, when you look at it that way, very good value for money. As a wise old man once said, it is true from a certain point of view. Now, this car also has launch control, and launch control in this car is quite good fun. Allow me to show you how you use it. First, you need a quiet piece of road with visibility all around you so that you may do this safely. You turn traction control into its sport mode. You turn the car into sport on the automatic gearbox. You make sure to disable the auto start stop feature and the auto hill hold feature. You then, using both feet, you press one on the brake pedal, the other on the accelerator, and then within the next 5 seconds, you let go. The result, according to Eva magazine, was a 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds. 3.7. That's seriously, obscenely fast. Let's take price out of the equation for just a second. If you already own an S3, should you buy one of these? Well, let's assume it's the same generation as this, as with the S3 I've been driving this morning. Should you upgrade to one of these? Maybe. If you really, really love the S3 and it does everything that you need of a car, and you do not want something bigger, and you're very happy with the way the interior is and everything else, you just want something simply quicker and a bit better looking, go for it. But if you want something that's really, really different, I would say look elsewhere. Even within the Audi catalogue, you'll find stuff that is truly different. Things like the RS4 or the RS5 are a completely different setup and will give you a very, very different experience. However, if you're looking to get into the brand fresh, as it were, which one should you get? Well, does outright performance matter to you? If so, the RS3 is certainly quicker, and it is quicker in the real world. However, from my limited testing, I would say that the S3, or certainly the S3 I drove, is a little better in terms of feel, but there is a compromise. People always talk about understeer with these things. Now, when I was driving and filming the S3 earlier, I didn't have any problems with understeer. However, when I turned the cameras off and I was driving back to then pick this up, I did actually have understeer at reasonably low speeds at a few corners. That, in this case, I'm going to put down to the sheer fact that the car was on all-season tyres, and it is just way too hot for those. way too hot. They'd obviously got up to temperature and they'd gone over temperature, and it just wasn't enjoying things at all. So I wouldn't hold that against the car. However, you can't deny that this car also has a lot more front end grip. So the S3 is going to find its limits sooner than this. But I found it a little more enjoyable to steer. So really you have to make your mind up where your priorities lie. This, of course, also is a lot more money, but for me it's also quite special, and that largely really is down to that engine. I've had a number of comments. I put a little cryptic picture of the RS3 up on my Instagram yesterday and asked people what they wanted to know about the car. One person's question was, is the engine the star of the show? Yes. Yes, it is. It is an awesome engine, and I hope that Audi find a way of putting it in more products. Would it suit something like an R8? No. It's very boosty, there is turbo lag there, it's not a perfect power plant. However, it very much suits the nature of a hot hatch. It suits this car. Somehow, I don't think it would suit the saloon as much, although my personal preference would always be for the saloon. That's a taste thing. That's simply what I prefer a car to be. But one cannot take price completely out of the equation. So let's get these both back together and let's talk about that price. So here we are, back in the real world where money really does matter. Now this car, as tested, is £53,000. Now the current RS3 is around £7,000 more expensive than the equivalent S3. However, as we know, this car is about 5 years older and is a previous generation, is a different spec, it's manual, yada yada yada. So, what's the price of this? Well, it's up for sale at an incredibly reasonable $17,995. Now, I'm not really just using this as a way of advertising the fact this car is for sale, because the reality is that by the time you see this video, this car's probably already gone. The guys here don't ask me to help sell their cars for them. No. I'd love to know what you would do. Now, of course, the good news is that if you really do lust after one of these, but your budget is more this, you're still gonna get most of the experience. For me, the big thing I'd actually miss would be the looks and the sound. And the looks really are marginal. I'm sure there are people that prefer this, and there's plenty of people that definitely prefer the 3-door configuration. And for those, of course, you're gonna have to buy one of these. The RS3 of the time also had a 5-pot lump, but was down on power quite a bit compared to the newer car. However, if your budget does stretch to this, and you want a decent, easy to drive, not overly large, incredibly capable, all-weather, point-to-point machine, this has got to be one of the best cars on sale today. The only other way I could think of better spending this sort of money is by buying this and that. For the price of that RS3, new of course, you could actually technically have that S3 and this Aston Martin V8 Vantage. You'd actually have a little bit of change. Now the truth is that the RS3 is actually quite a bit quicker than this, much cheaper to run. It's also a pretty car, although of course not quite as pretty as an Aston, but then what is, and miles more practical. So really, it works the other way as well, I suppose. If you've already got two cars and you want to consolidate it down into one, the RS3 is quite a good thing. But if you've got space for two and you want something nice and practical, I'd get the S3 and something fun. The great thing with the S3 is that it is a great all-rounder. The main thing for the RS for me is that engine, and because of that, I think the RS3 will mean that you won't get people saying you've just bought a Golf in a different dress. The RS3 truly has a different character, and most unexpectedly, a very different feel from the moment you sit in it. So that was a pleasant surprise. Anyway, Thanks guys for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this brief and somewhat different video from me. Please like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you'd buy. We'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.